please,
All
Frank,
right.
thank you so much for inviting Elaine, and please do the honors of inviting or welcoming and introducing her.
Well, thank you. And Elaine, it's really a pleasure to have you here and for you to be willing to talk. Elaine and her husband moved to Amador County and took Fiddletown by storm. And its history has never been the same for the better. Elaine has a BA degree in history, and correct me if I have any of this wrong, BA degree in history from University of California in Berkeley, and received her MA in library science from USC. Elaine was the head of research department at the Pasadena Public Library. In 2001, Elaine and her husband moved to Fiddletown to raise fruits and nuts. And I had a
Very California. It's very California.
Yeah, I had a whole lot of smart remarks about that, but I'll let it go. Elaine's passion for local research led to her first book, Fiddletown, From Gold Rush to Discovery. And Kevin Starr wrote the foreword for this wonderful book. And here's the book here. And I don't know how many people know Kevin Starr, but he was the head of the California State Library and absolutely a magnificent historian in his own right. Elaine's next book is Banished and Embraced, Chinese in Fiddletown and the Mother Lode. And she is a foremost authority, in my opinion, on the Chinese in the Mother Lode as well as Fiddletown. So please welcome Elaine Zorbas.
Hello, glad to be here. Fiddletown, I was thinking that maybe there's somebody from Placerville there, since this is a Placerville History Channel, but if not, Fiddletown is located about 20 miles from Placerville, its neighbor, and about 45 miles from Sacramento. And like Placerville, it had its start during the gold rush. It was a, can we have the next slide? Jennifer, next slide. Okay, next one. Okay, so this is the really earliest authenticated picture of Gold Rush Fiddletown from 1856. It was a photo taken by a man named Dennis Townsend, who was Fiddletown's first postmaster and also the first school teacher. He became superintendent of schools in Volcano, and I'm working on a book about him. But one of the interesting things about this photo, he took it to show his sister where the post office was, which is the third building down. But the corner building is called Belle Creole Baths. So there was obviously a place for miners to go and clean themselves up. So we found no other tracing of that. So it's very interesting. Next slide. Okay, this is kind of an iconic picture of Fiddletown. The building is the Fiddletown Community Hall, which was built in 1934 as a dance hall and also to celebrate the coming of electricity to Fiddletown. And that building isn't an old building. Fiddletown has quite a few buildings between 1855 and the 1880s. But the building next to it, the little square building, was once a store, and that is historic. It's brick, and it is now used as an exchange library and also a food pantry on Mondays and Fridays. So there's real community use of these buildings. Okay, the next slide. This building is still in Fiddletown. It's no longer a general store, which it was for ages, with much turnover of people who owned the store. It was built in 1858, and you'll notice the raised part in front, and that's so wagons pulled by horses could unload their supplies. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. And these are all on Main Street, by the way. And this building. It's not in this wonderful shape as it was in 1862. It was built in 1862 and eventually occupied by Isaac Cooper, who was the nephew of James Fenimore Cooper. And it was a very beautiful, stately house. So Fiddletown still has the ambience of a gold rush town. And it's had, I'm trying to think, it had a large Chinese population from the very beginning. The population of the town at its highest was probably 2,000. A lot of people say these gold rush towns have 10,000. They like to bandy that statistic. But really, at the most, it had 2,000, and at least 1/3 of the population was Chinese, maybe more. And the Chinese proportionally were a large part of Fiddletown. By 1880, they were half of the town. And Fiddletown became known as a Chinese town, a place where the Chinese could find refuge and where they could work and live. By 1860, Fiddletown had a Chinese district that abutted the European American district, commercial district on Main Street. And that included boarding houses, gambling house, several grocery and merchandise stores, and of course the Chukhi herb store. Can we have the next slide? This is a picture of the Chukhi store. It was never a joss house as is written in this. A joss house was a temple. It never served as a temple. This was after its first restoration in 1987, in which the pitch of the roof was changed to mirror both the way Chinese built, had the shakes, and also the original building. The roof had been lowered by the townspeople because it was leaking earlier. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, this is the Chukhi store now. This is after our latest project, which was to get a new roof on the building. And I'll talk about that at the end, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background about the Chukhi store. And also Chinese buildings in Fiddletown. Fiddletown has more Chinese buildings. That's a total of 4, including the Chukhi store, from an early period, 1855 to 1860. And it has more buildings of this vintage than any other town in California, as far as we know. Now, it had many other buildings, but they were wooden and succumbed to fire. The Chukhi store actually operates as a museum. Unfortunately, it's closed now because of COVID-19, but it is staffed by docents on Saturdays from 12 to 4, seasonally from April through October. It's not open normally during the winter because it's what's called a rammed earth building. And that is a technique that was common in China, where earth was packed between forms and to make thick walls. So the walls in some places are 3 feet thick, and that makes the store very nice and cool in the summer, but cold in the winter. Okay, next slide. Okay, this man was very important to Fiddletown history. He was born the name of Fong Chao Yu, but he became known as Jimmy Chow. He was the last person of Chinese ancestry to live in Fiddletown. And he was born in 1885. He died in 1965. And he lived in the Chukhi store most of his life. And fortunately was a pack rat because he did not discard what came before him. And he was also somebody that was very much loved and accepted in the Fiddletown community. As he aged, he was a bachelor his whole life. He had very bad arthritis. People would bring wood to heat up the building and the wood stove They would take him to the hospital. They would bring him to Chinese stores in Stockton. And he was very much accepted and loved in the community. Next slide. Now the Fiddletown, the Chukey store is unique because it's fully furnished. And let me just run through the people who live there. The first occupant of the store was named oh God, I'm getting mixed up, Yi Feng Chung. And he was an herb doctor. He came to mine initially, but he was trained to be skilled in herbs. The store functioned as an apothecary, and that meant that he not only prescribed customized, sorry, my mind isn't thinking. He not only prescribed remedies, but he also diagnosed. So he would diagnose. The herbs that he used were imported from China. The drawers that you see on the left were all labeled with the names of different herbs. Eventually, much later, we identified them. And the various objects, bottles, prescription packets that he left behind are still in the store. And the wonderful thing is that his family is now in their 8th generation, I think. Many live in Fiddletown, the Yi family. They've been very supportive of the store, and particularly Dr. Herbert K. Yi, who said this is where they got their start in America. So the store is full of implements and objects, artifacts, furnishings, everything original. Can we have the next slide? I just wanted to run through a few of these. The red boxes were opium boxes. Opium was legal until 1909, and it was imported from Hong Kong, went from Hong Kong to San Francisco, and then out into the various Chinese stores throughout California and other parts of the country. Next. And then the baskets, and there were lots of baskets in the store, were used by the herb doctor, Dr. Yi, to collect herbs, to winnow herbs. And you'll also see a scale for weighing whatever he prepared. And there are also many objects of everyday life. Some of these were probably used by Jimmy Chow because he lived in the store. He was a carpenter, by the way, also a butcher, handyman, and he did not discard what was already in the store. Next. The wonderful thing about the Chukey store is it's really a testament to Chinese immigrant life. It's fully furnished as people lived from 1855, and the store was occupied until 1965. So that's over 100 years of occupation by the Chinese. Now, Dr. Yi went on to found other stores in Sacramento and Virginia City, and he was succeeded by a man named Chukey in the 1880s. Chukey was a gambler, and he also he had stock in the gambling house across the way. I'll talk to you about that a little bit. But he operated the store as a merchandise store and a grocery, and also sold paraphernalia for gambling. And he and his wife, Sai Choi, who he married in 1872, were asked to take care of a little boy whose family went back to China. And that little boy was Feng Chao Yu, or Jimmy Chow. So they really raised the child. And in the bedroom, you can't see it in this picture. You can see the bed is just a plank, but there's a small child's bed next to it where the little boy slept when he was small. So it's fully furnished. It was not only a place of business. The front part has many, many artifacts and objects from the various incarnations of the store. For instance, Chuki sold cigars, so there are a lot of cigar boxes there, and big stoneware jars where rice and tapioca were stored that Chuki must have furnished to the community. So it's very, very unique. In fact, there's really nothing like the Chuki store of this vintage. And it's a time capsule, really. Everything's authentic. And it was an inspiration for me to do more research into Chinese culture, because it's not just history, it's culture. How did the Chinese live? What implements did they use to work, live in daily life? We have pottery from them, for instance. And I'll just say a couple of words. When I worked on my book, I found out how unique this particular structure was because I made the acquaintance with a wonderful Chinese historian and translator, Sonia Ng, and we discovered many, many paper artifacts in the store, books, ledgers, and that told a very complete history of a Chinese community that survived from the 1850s into the early 19th century. So let's have the next slide. Let's see. Oh, wait, go back. I'm sorry, go back to the one with the bedroom. Okay, so after Jimmy died, because I want to talk to you about preservation, the store was unoccupied. Jimmy didn't have a will, so the state took over the store. Well, Fiddletown had a preservation society that had just formed in the year before in 1964, and that was to save the one-room schoolhouse. Schools had moved to another place, and that schoolhouse was in danger of demolition. So a group of interested people who loved the history of this little town formed together. The Fiddletown Preservation Society was incorporated as a nonprofit, very smart move, in 1965. And that particular organization approached the Amador County to say, okay, if you will take custody of the Chuki store and the gambling hall, which came with it, were property of Jimmy Chow, we will operate the store, we'll clean it up, we'll make it into a museum and open it to the public periodically. So, it says my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just got a note that.
Yes, we do. We're hearing.
Okay, okay. So the Fiddletown Preservation Society formed to preserve, maintain, and restore the historical buildings, records, and relics of Fiddletown. And that's been 50 years of activism in trying to preserve our Chinese buildings, which are so important to the heritage of Fiddletown. In 1967, we had an agreement, formal agreement with Amador County that essentially the Fiddletown Preservation Society would manage the buildings and do minor repairs, but that Amador County would own the buildings, own the property, and help with major repairs. That management agreement was modified a little bit during one of our other restoration periods in 2008, which said, yes, they will help with major projects, but the Preservation Society is expected to contribute by raising funds and getting grants. So in the 70s, this is 5 years after Jimmy died, the historical preservation movement really got a start, and Fiddletown was in the middle of it early on because there was often controversy, and still is often, about preserving historic buildings. In this case, a company wanted to construct, rather extract limestone east of Fiddletown. And that would require 36-ton trucks to come through the town every 10 minutes. And that, of course, could endanger the fragile historic structures in the town. So the Preservation Society objected to this. They were joined with the Amador Historical Society. It became widely publicized. At that time, one of the Yee family members, a senior one, Herbert K. Yee, chimed in and went before the County Board of Supervisors protesting the fact that this company was going to endanger the buildings. It took 4 years to stop the project. And one of the better outgrowths of this was that the Preservation Society, I'm going to call it the FPS because that's what we call ourselves, the FPS, it's shorter, applied to the National Register of Historic Places. And Fiddletown was recognized in 1978 as having 18 historic sites. Number 1 on the historic sites was the Chukey store. Number 2, the gambling house. Number 3, another building that was known as the Chinese General Store. And then the 4th building was a privately owned adobe property on a hill. And the sites included non-structural things like the cemetery. So that was an important step to getting grants, for instance, to be on the National Register. We were also, the town was also a California historic landmark, another important thing. So let's go to the 1980s now. The store, by the way, was opened periodically. The tremendous amount of work, I wasn't there, but a tremendous amount of work went into cleaning the store, organizing it, making it presentable for the public. But by the middle of 1987, there was a problem, and that's that this adobe part of the store and wooden additions, which were built to accommodate Jimmy Chow. There were 2 kitchens, a living area, and a much bigger bedroom, because of course he could fit in that little tiny bed. I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, just a moment. The wooden portions were separating from the main part of the building. So Dr. Herbert K. Yee approached the FPS and said that he thought there might be grants available. There were grants available through the Parks and Recreation Association. So we applied for a grant, received an $88,000 grant. That was a lot of money in those days. And of course, most grants had to be matched. And because of that, we hired and contracted with an archaeological firm, Foothill Resources, which was headed by an archaeologist, Julia Costello, and also obtained the expertise of somebody who had worked with rammed earth buildings, Dave Easton. And a tremendous amount of work was done on the building then. The back part was, everything there was taken out. There were over 1,000 objects. All of those objects had to be cleaned, cataloged, identified. There was excavations around the store. The store got a new roof. The low tin roof was replaced, got drains, and the project was widely publicized. There was even articles in the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and of course the Sacramento newspapers. When it was finished, when it was completed, the project received the Governor's Award and also special recognition to the Yee family, which contributed $10,000, plus local money was raised as well. So that was the 1980s. In the 1990s, the store was open with docents every Saturday and ready for public display. So let's go to the next slide now. Okay, there were other buildings in Fiddletown's Chinatown that had been neglected. They didn't have the objects inside like the Chukey store did, but they were still an important part of a historic Chinatown. The gambling house, and you're seeing pictures after restoration, but it was in bad shape. As I mentioned, Chukey also had gotten this property, and the back was separating from the front. And in the 70s, it was noticed that it needed work, but no work was done. Okay, and then there was another building. Next slide. Next. This was a Chinese general store. This was a privately owned building in very bad condition. And its owners were two people from Berkeley who owned other property in Fiddletown and felt that this was an important building, historic building, and wanted to donate the building to a preservation organization. Well, FPS couldn't afford the building, to a government entity. So we were able to make a case with the county to acquire the building. And the case was made that, okay, well, with two buildings, we would have a better chance of getting grants. And the county agreed to that. So in 2001, the building became county property in addition to the gambling house. So those are three buildings owned by the county. Now this, I moved to Fiddletown in 2001, and at that time a committee got together and a new project was born, and we named it the ROCS Project, ROCS, Restoration of Chinese Structures. And there were grants available. There was public monies available in those days for brick and mortar projects. So we got together with a member of Foothill Resources, the archaeological firm that had worked on the Chukey store in 1987. And one of the principals of the store was an architectural historian, and she helped us write a grant. And that grant was for something called the California Heritage Fund. It was overseen by the Office of Historic Preservation. And we were able to get a grant of $203,000, but it wasn't enough. And it had to be matched. You know, where else do you get $203,000? So the Fiddletown Preservation Society embarked on a lot of publicity, for one thing. We have to remember that Fiddletown is far from cities. In fact, on the Sacramento News about a month ago, it was referred to as being remote. And there are no Chinese people left in Fiddletown. So we started an effort to advertise and publicize the fact that these buildings were in terrible condition in order to get support from the Chinese community in Sacramento. That's our closest big city. And Sacramento had a couple of very active Chinese organizations then. We, with their help, actually, one of them was called the Sacramento Chinese Culture Foundation, and they helped us with getting people to have an event in Fiddletown. And in 2005, we had the first of 3 Chinese Heritage Days in Fiddletown. We had it in the park. A calligrapher was demonstrating there. We had somebody talk about Chinese medicine and Chinese music, Chinese goodies, and quite a few people from Sacramento came out, including our benefactor, Herbert K. Yee, his family. And I don't know if some of you remember March Fong Yu, but she was Secretary of State, retired at that time, but she also came. And it really helped to create an awareness, having 3 in a row of these festivities. It was covered in the World Journal, a local Chinese magazine newspaper out of San Francisco. But we didn't make a lot of money from these events. We got support, and that support was important later on because we were able to get a second grant. The Office of Historic Preservation actually encouraged us to apply, and this was a wonderful program called the California Cultural and Historic Endowment, CCHE. And there was a lot of money available. It was orchestrated through the state library, and many, many projects were done throughout the state of California. Well, we applied and we received $207,000. So now we had, just about $500,000 to work with. But we also had to raise other money. And so one of the things we did is have a campaign to sell bricks, memorial bricks, commemorative bricks. We had different levels of membership, and we raised an additional $30,000 from various sources, including the Chinese community. Well, the project was completed in 2008, and I wanted to show you all of the work that was involved in that. We also contracted with a historical architect who operated out of San Francisco, Garavaglia Architecture. So can I have the next slide? This was the gambling hall, and you can see how much of the brick had to be removed. A lot of it was in bad shape, missing bricks, and we had expert masons work on the building. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we had to get old bricks to match the bricks that were there because chemically, modern bricks and modern mortar would not work together with the brick. Next slide. Next slide. The gambling house was actually built by Chinese, and its back part was stone, which was built into the hill. The back wall is actually sloping, and the brick facing was starting to come apart from the stone. So that was part of the work that had to be done. You can see the missing bricks there and some of the fissures. Next slide. Next slide. Jennifer, are you here? Uh-oh, I think Jennifer just faded. Oh, here it is.
No,
okay.
I think there's a delay going through the internet.
Oh, okay. Okay. This was the work on the general store. That's a 2-story building. The upper part was a loft where supplies were kept. And again, major brickwork. That store had huge fissures underneath its front windows. It was bowing out. It was unstable. And in fact, the county had the former owner of the store put in supports to prop up the store before the county would acquire it. At any rate, the project was completed in 2008. It included exterior renovation of the stores, weatherproofing, drainage, and this project too received the Governor's Award and also an award from the California Preservation Foundation. So now we come to the current. Next slide. Okay, and between 2018 and 2020, there was work that needed to be done at the Chukey store. That's one of the things the Fiddletown Preservation Society, as manager of the store, has to be alert to problems, maintenance, what needs to be done. It's a weighty role. Well, we started a new project called Raise the Roof because the roof was 30 years old and we needed a new roof, and protect the artifacts because the paper artifacts in the store, which are so important because they really tell the story of the Chinese presence with banners, an altar, newspaper on the walls. The paper artifacts were falling apart. So here is a tea box, for instance. You can see the corner is kind of torn off. Next slide. These were New Year's greetings that probably Chu-Ki, maybe Jimmy Chow, but probably Chu-Ki received from some of his customers and suppliers, which were again falling apart. Some of them had actually fallen off. Next slide. And you can see here the state that some of the paper artifacts were in. The newspaper on the walls both gave information, and in some cases, like in the bedroom, was there for insulation. Well, we were able to find a paper conservator. Two of us actually from the Preservation Society had attended a class at the State Library in how to take care of paper, but we needed an expert. We couldn't do it. And we found a young woman from Jennifer Parsons from Kala Conservation in Boulder, Colorado at the time. And she was willing to come to California. So she came in 2008 and did a paper assessment, spent a few days. No, she just spent one day actually, and conducted a paper assessment and wrote up a report of what needed to be done. And then we hoped in the future to be able to have her finish the work, really do the job. A lot of work needed to be done. Well, we had the problem of the roof, and we really didn't want to do paper conservation before we did the roof, if possible. Now, the roof was a major project, so the county was involved with that. And the county, one of the things with being in a tiny little place far away from everything is that initially we could not get roofers to even give us estimates for replacing the roof. So in April of 2018, the FPS met with the Board of Supervisors in the county and said, we need a new roof. We had just a not very good estimate that was way below price. The county said, okay, we'll oversee the project, and but you have to raise the money for the rest of the roof. One of the things that our board decided was that because the store had been given a historic roof in 1987, that we wanted a similar roof, and that required having shakes that would be 36 inches long and specially treated for fire prevention. Those shakes were not available in this country. They were only available from Canada, and they were very expensive. So that put the price of the project up. The architect that we had worked with on the Rocks project designed the roof with specifications, and that was presented to the county, and then it was up to the county to go out for bid. That was a long delayed project. And with two episodes of trying to get enough bids, both the proposals that we got were few, and they were very expensive, and the county wouldn't go for it. So we found ourselves in 2019 without a roof. But in the meantime, we were trying to raise money. So in 2018, one of our members, who is Chinese, part of the Yi family, arranged to partner with this Chinese American Council of Sacramento and have a fashion show of beautiful Chinese robes and clothing, historic robes. And that gave us some good money. And then we also hosted in Amador City at the Imperial Hotel a fundraising dinner in 2019. So that gave us some seed money. But the fact is we were in a time when government money was not available. And we had an expensive project in which the county said, we'll contribute this much, but no more. So it was a real challenge for our organization to try to get enough funding and then to find a roofer who would even do the job. So we, after the bids failed, I had a local roofer who didn't pan out. So by December 2019, we were in the rainy season and we didn't have a roof. Luckily, the roof, even though it was deteriorating, was not leaking inside the store, and the county agreed to tarp the building during the rainy season. Well, there was a good roofer that we had heard about. He was too busy, I think, during the first runs of the bids, but Gordon Mott of El Dorado County, close to Placerville, Diamond Springs, we talked to him over the holidays. He said, I can't do it right away, but he finally agreed that he would do the roof, and the county was okay with that. So let's have the next slide. So it took until June of this summer. By that time, of course, COVID-19 was prevalent, the pandemic, so we couldn't open the museum anyway. So he and his workers put on a wonderful new roof. I should mention that we had to have the paper preservation done before the roof. Jennifer Parson could only come over the holidays. She came in January 2019 and completed most of the paper preservation, did a wonderful job. We removed objects to protect them. We hung plastic sheetings to protect the inside of the building. And that part of the project was funded by a wonderful Chinese person, historian and translator, who understands the value of the Chukchi store and its wonderful cultural story that it tells. We had funding for that. We did get some small local grants, and our greatest support really came from the descendants of the original Yifeng Chang, the Yi family, and another family from another direct descendant from the Hing family also contributed funds, and we were able to get this very expensive project done. So we're taking a breather. Can we see the last slide? That's how it looks now. It looks really beautiful. We've hardly had any rain, so it looks just like it looks in the picture, the roof. We're very proud of this roof. I would just say that the components of preservation were, first of all, having a very committed organization. People on our board spent hours trying to put together this project on the events and other things. Having a partnership with the county, having a partnership with the Sacramento Chinese American Council certainly was important. We had a brick campaign. I don't know if you can see this, but I don't think it shows up very well, but we had flyers so people could purchase memorial bricks, and had the events. So I think I'll stop there. I think I put everybody to sleep. So if you have questions or other comments, please contribute.
Thank you so much. That was
Frank.
just amazing. What an amazing effort. Go ahead, Frank.
Elaine, when you were doing your research, did you run across anything about the Sammy Yep and his family from Jackson?
Yes. Actually, I have a chapter in my book about the Yep family in Jackson.
I don't have your book.
You don't?
No, I have to get that book.
It's at the Sutter Creek Visitor Store Center, or you can order it through lulu.com.
Okay. I have your other one that you autographed for me, but I don't have that one.
Yeah, no, I have a chapter. This is a chance of a success for the Chinese who stayed. The Yap family came in the 1930s, worked at the National Hotel, and Sammy Yap ran a restaurant and eventually became mayor of Jackson. I got another message. Of course, there's one part of our project, Raise the Roof project, that's still to be done, and that's to rebuild the front porch. We hope that will be done this month. Again, we consulted with the historical architect, and we have a contractor lined up, and that should really finish the exterior of the building. And there's still work to be done on the interior. There's always work to be done on these old buildings. The gambling hall and the Chinese general store still need work on the interior to make them available for the public. Always work to be done.
Can you say again? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Ruth, and I'm from Placerville. I've lived here 35 years, and I really am. I thought your talk was fascinating, not boring in the slightest. I hung on to every word. So
Oh, thank you.
it's really, really great to hear how other people do this. We struggle here. We're probably at where you were in 1965 or whatever. Jennifer, maybe we're a little bit further along than that, but it's great that there was a dedicated group of people and that they made all of this happen. It's very exciting. One thing that made me think as you were speaking about this is I kept thinking about the town of Locke. And I'm just curious because I've spent some time there, and there's some similarities, and I just wondered if you were familiar with Locke and its
Sure.
Chinese history.
Yes. In fact, I visited Locke very many times, and I know their president and other people there. And Locke is kind of a supporter of us, and we're a supporter of them. Locke, of course, is much later, but they've done a tremendous job on restoring the boarding house in Locke. But that is owned by the Parks and Recreation Department, and they have some other governmental oversight that they have to abide by at the same time. But the Locke Foundation Society is was very active until COVID-19, stopped us all. But they've have fundraising banquets. They have a wonderful oral history program, interviewing people that lived in Locke, Chinese people that lived in Locke. And it's very active community.
I was just, while you were at the tail end of your talk, I was just Googled Locke just to see what I could read about the similarities. One thing, the Chinese, and I won't take too much time, but the Chinese were prevented from being able to own any property due to some, historic discriminatory laws. But I was reading that just recently, finally, some of this land is being offered to those families who historically had been there. And I don't remember all the details.
In Locke.
Yeah, in Locke. That sounded like a really nice development.
Can I add something? This is Sonia.
It's my colleague.
Okay. I just like to thank everybody who helped to preserve Fiddletown Chinese heritage as a Chinese descendant and a historian. Talking about Locke is much later developed the Chinese community than Fiddletown, almost half a century. And as Elaine knows me, as a historian focused on American Chinese or Chinese American history, Fiddletown is very, very unique. And it's the oldest because you can trace back from the Motherlode, the Gold Rush era. So just in a nutshell, Chinese people came here first wave was for the gold. Not necessarily to get rich, but they just work for the gold mine owners. And then after that, you all know that after the golds were gone, they work in the mines, the silver mines, the crystal mines, and other metal mines all over California. And then there came the railroad building, the Transcontinental. But after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, that's the beginning of Chinese people had to spread out to find their life, find their living. And one of the major development was the delta of American River. That's where Locke sits. And there was a movement called the grasshopper landowner, because the California state government, just like the homestead, you can use $1 to buy or to occupy a big piece of the delta swampland. But you have to, cultivate. You have to grow things. That's the way to develop. And then the Chinese worker who's discharged, in a sense, from the railroad or the mining, and they became farmer, because the American River Delta is very alike the hometown where they came from. It's the Pearl River and the West River in Guangdong. So they know how to pile the muds when the flood went, because in the summer it's all just like an ocean. In the winter, when the ice was frozen high on Sierra, so they pile the mud and they cut the grasses along the American River and burn them against the mud, and they build the levee roads. So the levee roads that we run now with cars, the bottom was built by Chinese people. And piece by piece of land, the agriculture of that region developed. And that's why we had Colin, we had Locke. Locke was the latest because, and then we have Walnut Grove, you have come across it, and then we have Iselton. And then in early 20th century, Walnut Grove came across a big fire, all destroyed. And some of the Chinese decided to build new home instead of rebuild their home in Walnut Grove, and that's Locke. And also, like Cortland, like Walnut Grove, Iselton, because it's along the American River. In 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, is the route, the main route from Sacramento to San Francisco. So at that time, it's the boat pier or port along the river. So that's what I want to give you a nutshell of development where Locke now is.
Well, thank you. That was really, that was fascinating. Thank you.
I want to add one correction too. Actually, the Chinese did own property in Fiddletown and in lots of the towns around here. It was only after the 1913 Alien Land Law that they couldn't own property. And of course, it depended on what community and what area they were in, because there was a lot of discrimination. But Main Street, Fiddletown had quite a few Chinese property owners. Any other questions?
Ellen, I did want to come back to the roof. I think you said something about how you had to treat it for fire resistance, which I thought was interesting because it looks, I guess it is a type of wood shake,
Oh,
I think,
it,
correct?
it is
And
wood.
it, right. And that's, of course, in, just the East Bay or, just the Bay Area where, there's been obviously the Oakland Hills fire. I mean, it's kind of the classic type of roof that would be, the biggest concern. But it sounds like, again, these trade-offs with preservation, but that you found a way to treat it and address the fire concern. And I just thought it would be interesting to hear you say something a little bit more about that, because I'm sure that was complicated.
Yeah, these were specially, the shakes were specially treated for fire prevention. But as you know, shakes are really not allowed in California. So there had to be an exception for this. And another thing that we had to do, that was another expense that came up, is the county wanted us to have Class A fire treatment. It's called Class A fire treatment. So there are extra materials in there that make the roof more fire resistant. That said, it's still wood. It probably will need to be retreated in about 2 years. And we're hoping the county will help us with that.
And what kind of wood is it? Do you know?
Cedar. I believe it's cedar.
Cedar.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And so so just again, then you have to treat it how many years between treatments?
I think about every 2 years. Actually, the gambling hall also has a wood roof, and that needs treatment right now.
Wow.
So,
Well,
That's a lot of
what an
upkeep every 2
amazing-
years.
but it is a trade-off between being, looking historical, looking similar to the way it was originally constructed, and the choices that one has now, because there are other materials that are more fire resistant than, of course, wood. But we chose to go the historical route and have it look as unique as it had looked after 1987 and in its early days.
And then I just had one other question, which was, I guess, first of all, is there a part of China, that this original maybe group that settled in Fiddletown came from? Because China's so big. And then, were they really, do we know much about those first settlers as far as, were they definitely came and were doing, I guess, placer mining, in the gravels like so many people were doing initially, or what do we know about, their sort of first activities?
Well,
Sounds like it was gold mining.
Yeah, most of the Chinese who came here after the gold rush, 1852, the crux of the gold rush was over by then, but they all came from the similar part of China. It's called Guangdong now, but many of us know it as Canton. It was southeastern China, close to Hong Kong. Hong Kong became a very important point of embarkation and debarkation. Sonia mentioned the Pearl River Delta. Many Chinese who came were from that part. Siyup, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but they came from there. But there were also other areas of China within this district. There were 24 districts within this part of China, and often the dialects were different from district to district. So there was a communication problem even between Chinese. We do know that Fiddletown, looking at later records, Sonia Ng helped really decode some of the wonderful things that we discovered, like a book to raise funds for the Chinese cemetery, and also a book of burial of the Chinese who were buried in Fiddletown. And initially, those people identified themselves by the district that they came from in that part of China. So we do have a bit of a portrait of the people who came where they came from. I don't know, Sonia, you may have more to say about that. No?
You answer the question.
Okay.
Well, in fact, you know, I was talking about Fiddletown is very, very unique in history because number one, Fiddletown, the Chinese community, the buildings that you are preserving are the oldest we can find in California and in the entire USA. The only one site that can be comparable, still we see a building, so to say, I don't know how true it is in Mendocino. Temple, a very, very tiny temple. They said it's built in 1850s. Otherwise, everywhere what we found, not to mention San Francisco, okay, because of the 1906 earthquake and fire, almost everything's gone. But around California, mostly the site we found today, like Marysville, like Oroville, like even Riverville, they came across big fire. You know, the Chinese community and the buildings, the temples mostly were rebuilt around 1884 to 1886. I don't know why. There's fire, of course, you can bet on that, the arson and natural fire and things like that. So Fiddletown is the oldest that we can still see the real heritage in physical sense. And number two, what Elaine mentioned, the two books are very, very important in history because not only the detailed, it's dated 1870, the books that Elaine mentioned. Not only they detail who came here, who died when, and it also showed the operation, the financial operation of Chinese community, how they put them, you know, saving their money and how they turn around, how they loan money in order to get some interest. So this is really, really precious because we heard about all these things, but it's in the record of the 1870 book of Fiddletown, and also in the Amador County Archive, it preserved now the oldest book that we can find in the US. That's a bone repatriation account book from the Samya people, dated 1863. And that's the oldest, whatever you say, document, books, artifact. That's what we can find. It's in Fiddletown. Thank you.
It's a treasure trove.
Can I ask Jennifer, are there other people lined up to talk? Because I had a question about that.
No, go ahead, Ruth, go ahead.
Okay, so here's my question about, you were talking about the oldest Chinese buildings, all right? So again, I live in Placerville and I actually own a building, an 1856 building on Main Street. And it was built right after one of the fires back then. And it's very nice in that the steel door and window are still in place in the back of the store, a very tall steel door, and it opened as a saddlery, and that was where the horses came into the saddlery in the back there. And there was a road in the back that now all the stores have built onto the back's workspaces, storage spaces. So there's no longer a road. The store is just extended, you know, to the back. So the road is gone. But what I'm getting at is, our store used to be decades ago, Rivendell Books, if you've been to Placerville.
Oh,
and-
I was
and-
there. I know that.
Yeah. And so, and now it's an art gallery.
Yeah.
We have 30 artists, and my husband's a pretty well-known photographer. But so if you remember Rivendell,
Yeah.
remember where there was that plexiglass that covered over the tunnel that went underground to the next street, which is Pacific. And Pacific is where the back of the post office is. And there's an existing 2-story white block building from the same era. And I'm going to ask Jennifer if she knows the exact year. And so there was a tunnel that went from what had been the Saddlery, by then it had become a saloon, our building, and it led from the saloon underground to an Asian brothel. And there's a brass plaque on that 2-story white block building, identifying its history as an Asian brothel. And so I'm just wondering, what's the vintage of that building? It's really an intriguing and beautiful building, don't you think, Jennifer? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I'm not sure, but now I'm really curious. I'll want to go look at that. It sounds like it's on Pacific.
Right, and what you do is, you know where Benham Park is on the right. If you're heading east on Pacific, you've gone around the corner, you've gone around the post office, and so you're on Pacific. You've gone up Sacramento Street, and you turn left on Pacific. And you go past Benham Park where the city pool is on the right.
Uh-huh.
And the very next building, as you start to go up the hill, is that 2-story white block building. And
Wow.
it's very old. And I'm gonna have to look at the plaque, because you ladies are saying that the oldest on record Chinese building is what year?
Probably 1855. That would be the Chukey store.
Okay, 55. Well, ours was built in 56. I mean, not that ours was a Chinese building, but okay. Well, that's interesting. I mean, this whole thing is so intriguing. And Jennifer will go look at that building. Maybe we'll meet up, Jennifer.
Yeah, and yes, I mean, and then, there was, in fact, recently some of the folks have been posting the photos of Chinatown in Placerville, which, I don't know. Hopefully it's got some good, documentation to go with these historic photos. But, we do come across references to the Chinese community in Placerville, which, may be after Fiddletown, but it's just really important heritage. It's so wonderful that you have this, this group and, that has taken on this legacy there in Fiddletown. Because, as you've said, you've raised enormous amounts of funds and you've gotten, really important recognition, it's really, really so inspiring. So thank you so much. It's really a gift to everyone. And I wanted to actually ask about the opium too. I just wanted to say, would that mean, I can't remember, how many different kinds of plants you can actually get the opium from, but were they actually growing the plants here then or were they somehow importing that?
They were importing it. They were importing it from Hong Kong. And there were different brands of opium. Some were the best and some were less favorable, but cheaper. But that was part of the wares of Chinese stores. And the trouble came when a lot of the Caucasians started to smoke opium as well. And I have some references in my book to that. Then it became a social disgrace for the Chinese. They were accused of bringing vice between that and also prostitution. Of course, their clients were Caucasians as well as Chinese. So there was a little bit of hypocrisy in there. I also wanted to mention that there were Chinatowns, or Chinese districts all over California. There was a Chinese presence almost everywhere, from the tiniest towns till Los Angeles and San Francisco and on the West Coast. But many of those towns were destroyed by fire, arson, Chinese were sometimes chased away from the towns, especially after the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, and development destroyed a lot of Chinatowns. So there's really very little left, especially of the early period, very little. That's what makes Fiddletown so special.
And I think it's very interesting that you got the county to buy the second Chinese building so that you said you'd have a better chance at grants having two, but you had the cooperation of the county. Because Jennifer,
Yeah,
that sounds pretty remarkable, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean it's great, and it does seem like there's a lot of broad-based. I have the sense that there's a broad-based awareness, appreciation for the history in Amador County in general. Just judging from, just sort of following the Ledger News, which I know the newspaper has kind of evolved and changed, but there's always been this presence of historic, like a column, it seems like, they definitely have a community that is interested and values that there. It seems.
yeah, there's a very active historical association here, and many historical sites throughout the county. That's what one of the main attractions are. We have the Kennedy Mine, for instance, and other sites that are very unique and special.
So Elaine,
Well, nice
we do have
talking to you.
I just wanted to mention we have Marla Cohen with us, and I know I linked you guys a little bit through email, but she did do her thesis on the Golden Chain Heritage Corridor there along Highway 49, and I just wondered if you remember that effort and how the preservation community in Amador County was thinking about that Heritage Corridor proposal for Highway 49.
I'm not familiar with it personally, and FPS hasn't been involved in it. But I'm sure there are people from the Historical Society who are. I also alerted somebody who is in Amador County who's interested in preservation about this program. So.
Oh, thank you.
But
Who is that?
Her name is Rebecca Brown.
Right. We just,
And
eventually.
she was going to work.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that the California Preservation Foundation was supposed to have their meeting in Sacramento this last spring, which of course was canceled because of the pandemic. But she was working with them and working out a program of having special tours to historic sites in Amador County.
Wow.
I gave her the links to your program.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was really just such an honor and an interesting evening to learn more about your work there. And, certainly, if there are other topics or things that, you would, like to share about, or if there are other speakers that you know of that you would like to suggest, we're always open, have, every Thursday is an opportunity. So did anybody have any last minute questions? We're just wrapping it up, but I just know we've got some other folks that haven't said anything. Just in case.
My name is Frank. I'm in Shingle Springs, and I just wanted to comment that thank you very much for what you're doing there in Fiddletown. Every time I go there, it's like going into a time capsule. It's absolutely beautiful.
It is.
The work that you've done
you.
with the Chukey store and preserving it is phenomenal. I thank you for it. I've been in that store probably 10, 12 times. Every time I go in, I'm amazed at the amount of work that has gone into it to keep it preserved. It's no small feat. And thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I second that, Elaine.
Oh, is that Frank? Thank you.
Yes.
I can't
It's
wait
a
to visit. I
great-
can't. We'll have to have a special field trip, but in the meantime,
Yes.
it's just great to know it's there and that you have this active group, and we just really appreciate you sharing tonight.
A great presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. I
Yeah.
should add that our group is getting older and we always want to have new members and new people who are interested in preservation. We could really use that on our board.
Well, if we wanted to sit in on a meeting, how would we do that?
Well, right now we're just meeting on Skype.
Yeah. So how could we get information?
Yeah.
I mean, we need to know when and where.
I
I
can,
mean, and how.
yeah. Let me check with our board, okay? You
Yeah,
can
let Jennifer know.
email me through Jennifer.
Okay. Or if you just let
And
Jennifer know.
I'll
if-
check.
Okay. If Jennifer says, I mean, I'll just take my information through Jennifer. If you find out it's okay, then if you let Jennifer know, she can
Yeah.
let me know. Okay.
Okay,
Great.
sounds
right.
good.
Great. All right. Well, this has been a great evening. Thank you so much, Elaine. That was really, really rich and just really grateful. I just see Marla just unmuted. Did you have something, Marla?
I was a little bit late coming in and I wanted to know the name of Elaine's book.
Oh, it's called Banished and Embraced, the Chinese in Fiddletown and the Mother Lode.
Great.
And I think it's
And actually,
listed.
she has two books. She has two books, and they were in the announcement. So you can actually go back to the email, and you'll see the titles too.
Okay, I will do that. The only introduction I had about the Chinese and their involvement in the gold rush and all that was a book that I read several years ago now. It was called On Gold Mountain by
Oh, yes.
Lisa C. It was very, very well done. It's a fascinating story. And so that was the only introduction I had, but this has been very informative. I did go through Fiddletown when I was on my journey up the Golden Chain in, I guess it was 2004-ish. And but it's always good to hear, and I'm glad that there's still a lot of preservation work going on out there. So thank you very much.
Great, a great role model for many communities and many historic districts. And we will also look forward to actually looking at your nomination, description for the National Register, because we like to look at examples of those as well. And it sounds like you have a great one. So.
Okay. All right, good night.
Thank you so much. All
Thank
right,
you.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Okay. Good night.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks.